without further ado, let me introduce my friend Kris. Kris is the CEO and founder of Duly, a leader in the tech industry with 20 years experience from some really, really cool companies ranging from very large software companies to a recent startup that he founded called Duly. You've been involved in startup revenues from, in excess of $100 million, and you built a pretty damn cool tool to boot. We use it at Predictable Revenue. If you've checked out the podcast, we came on with Jamie Buss, or we had Jamie Buss on a year and a half ago. She talked to me about her MedPick, or she taught me her MedPick qualification methodology, and I actually used Duly to make that happen and actually get our team to fill out the MedPick criteria. We actually use Medic, but he didn't pay me for that. I just like the tool, and so I thought I'd give him a shout out. So with that being said, Kris, take it away.
Awesome. Colin, thanks so much. I think this has been great for your audience to have 2 days of really smart people, giving them a lot of insight into different parts of sales and sales mechanics. So you can either thank me or blame me for going last. For those that are still around, hopefully I'm going to impart some good wisdom on you on how to redesign your enablement playbook for today's remote workforce. It's pretty clear that we're trending in a pretty wild direction with regard to remote selling, if not remote everything within the organization. So that's my job, is to give you a little bit of a background on how to do that better. So a little bit more about me, and I'm wearing the same pink shirt right now that I was wearing in this picture, but my hair is a little bit more frazzled thanks to the lack of barbers available right now. I'm a lifer in sales. I scaled my last company from 0 to 100 million. I was vision critical, as Colin mentioned. I lived in Australia. I lived in EMEA, ran some pretty big teams while I was abroad. And I really don't believe in virtual backgrounds. So you're actually seeing my real office. I wanted to come into my real office today to share that with you. And just a tiny bit about what we do. So we've built this real-time playbook for closers. It's a workbook that's designed to help a seller to really organize their day as efficiently as possible, to be able to take their notes in one spot, have those notes automatically update Salesforce on the fly, including contacts and fields and all the rest of that stuff, but at the same time helping to activate the content of the organization to support the salesperson in their deal cycles. It's the only thing I'll say about us. You can see some of the logos that are in there. That's who Duly is, in case you weren't aware of who we were. So I figured that given that we're talking about remote sales teams, we might as well start talking about the thing that's pretty top of mind for everybody right now. We've all been living this for about 2 months now, and that's the COVID effect, which is running from 2020 to God knows when. So hopefully, we're starting to see the world normalize a little bit more. But let me just give you a couple of thoughts on COVID before I jump into the other half of this journey. So as you know, the sales enablement gap that we're all living in right now is a lot wider than it was 2 months ago. 2 months ago, we were still having challenges of capturing and sharing the data that the sales teams were getting from their customers and delivering that back to the organization. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, Salesforce adoption, all the rest of that stuff. And the enablement team are really struggling from that. As a result, they really don't know what content is performing well, what talking points are performing well, et cetera. So there's this broken disconnect between both sides of the organization. That distance has gotten a lot further with remote sellers that are all tasked with quotas that are harder to attain right now, and focusing more and more of their attention to their prospects and less of their attention and time toward internal mechanics, if you will. So yeah, the go-to-market is really shifting right now. And I want to stress that your decision maker, if you haven't really realized this yet, your decision maker has fundamentally changed. The narrative control that you have right now is more important than ever. And before we moved into this new world of work, with new teams almost fully remote, priorities are continuing to shift day by day. Deal cycles are always going to continue to extend through this as people are trying to figure out, what does the world look like a month from now, 3 months from now, 2 quarters from now? And consumer confidence is really low right now too. So to empower your reps to win in today's market, you really need to think about smart enablement content that's being torn down from what you had originally and rebuilt to bridge those new realities. And whether you're building a new enablement strategy from the ground up or you're just doing a refresh to your existing playbook, adapting your go-to-market is going to be super essential right now. The person that you once were talking to that had the authority to make decisions on purchasing your product is probably no longer in that situation. Everything has laddered up. In some cases, we're even seeing board level approval being required for unbudgeted expenses. So given that your buyer is shifting, so does your message have to. All right. So let's talk a little bit about conversation starters and then build into conversation continuers. So how do you keep the conversation moving forward? Conversation starters will be different than they were before, for sure. COVID messaging is actually really underperforming. In case nobody's mentioned that yet, I'm sure that others that have presented over the last couple of days have said it. But it's really underperforming relative to thoughtful outreach. And with the right tone and the right messages, we can really push past that discomfort and keep the channels of communication open. Companies that attempt to use the crisis to generate more sales or market share are risking doing irreparable damage to their brands right now. But the good news is people really do want to hear from the brands that they're interested in, that they were shopping pre-COVID. Kantar actually did a survey of over 35,000 participants and found that the vast majority of customers and prospects really want to hear from their consideration set brands. Only about 8% of respondents thought that the brand should stop advertising or reduce advertising during this pandemic. So, but how they want to hear from you is really different though. It's more empathetic, it's more helpful. Mimic this thinking with your enablement content to ensure that your sellers' communications are motivated by genuine desires to solve and improve people's problems and improve their lives, not necessarily just to grow your own revenues, which is self-serving and doesn't really work in the best of times. This is particularly important when you're thinking about a protracted sales cycle. Now you have more touch points that are going to be across a more expanded horizon than they were before. So you're going to need to think about ways to keep your buyer engaged over that longer period of time. And the words just checking in is really a surefire recipe for failure. So think about what you can do in your enablement practice to layer in better touch points over those periods of time. And that starts, we start to think about the centralized messaging strategy. So sales enablement is largely responsible for shifting the tone of the messaging for their sales team. And they're often learning this stuff on the fly. But they also need to keep lockstep with marketing, who's also changing their messaging. Our entire website is going through metamorphosis right now at Dooley, and other parts of the business are also changing their messaging. So having a good cross-functional team that manages the messaging is going to be really important, or is really important. And it really needs to work in an agile way using virtual learning and collaboration tools when you're thinking about empowering your team with those dynamic shifts in the messaging that you're crafting. Those that are in charge of the messaging really need to track sales momentum, new risks to your customers' businesses that we're seeing in the marketplace and in the news. Think about new supply chain issues that might be coming up, customer challenges, HR problems, and safety concerns that are now like a daily concern for everybody. I actually had a conversation with somebody a few weeks ago where one of the sales managers was in a pack and play with her 1-year-old, trying to entertain her 1-year-old while being on a call with me. That the messaging I'm using with somebody like that is fundamentally different than the messaging I'm using 2 months ago, and how you're helping that person navigate that experience. So a lot of the sales team members that are in your organization are facing these new realities, and they're finding them really challenging. You have to remember that a lot of people, this is their first job, and for sure it's their first pandemic. So prior to this, selling was probably a lot easier. We were actually in a state where spending was pretty loose and pretty free. So you need to teach new skills to deal with adversity in a down market. Some of us have been through it before. Colin and I are older, so we've been through a down market once or twice before. But it should be something that you help your whole team to level up their skills with regard to. And don't forget that you're not only teaching your sales team how to modify their delivery, you're teaching them how to cope as they're introduced to new tools, they're introduced to new objections, new timelines, a new buyer persona, and of course, new messaging overall. That's a lot to take on over this period of time. So we need to think about the key moments in a sales cycle, and we need to think about how we're going to redefine them and try to regain momentum with something that's a bit more data-driven than what we were used to before. And I'll talk a little bit about battle cards, blanket objections, and qualifying criteria. Sales really needs to be prepared to handle the 5 most common conversations with existing customers, which starts with developing a crisis battle card or a series of crisis battle cards. You're going to learn from me over the course of this conversation. I'm pretty focused on micro content. I'm a big believer in it. This should be something that includes a plan for salespeople's responses to things like new schedules for contact, right? I have one customer who said, look, my security review can't happen for another 180 days. So we need to figure out how we're going to buffer that with different contact points in between existing deals and service levels, negotiation for new contracts. And a lot of times you're going to even be involved in renegotiating existing ones or ones that have already crossed the line but haven't been implemented yet. Resuming and rerouting services and supplies, pricing changes, and even emerging best practices in their industry. Don't forget that sales can provide great insight here, right? So we're not just meant to be people that are trying to push the deal forward. We're also meant to be informative and helpful and useful during those key moments during a deal. So, and that's particularly the case in small and mid-sized businesses who might not be getting that information internally. Teach your teams to be respectful and aware of the corporate holy grail, which for everybody right now is cash flow, and recognize that your prospects are being mandated to be respectful of their cash flow internally as well. And sales leaders really need to rework and develop the digital sales playbooks to guide their teams into engaging with customers virtually. The playbook should probably detail optimal practices and expectations for working remotely. Again, a lot of people haven't done this before, including the use of new or incremental technologies that they're being introduced to, sometimes remotely being introduced to for the first time, new processes for managing deal activity and reporting up information, and managing expectations with customers who will be in the same situation as I mentioned on their end. So without question, the mix has changed a lot over the last little while. We have more touch points that will be required to keep our prospect engaged and to keep your brand top of mind. It's also really become clear that part of the new enablement regimen will need to include a 101 on social selling and one-to-one or account-based marketing so we can keep targeting the right individuals within those accounts in the new mediums. Sales and marketing really need to learn to build engagement across these multiple channels to create impactful experiences for their prospects. Given the loss of a lot of the traditional B2B touch points, events, conferences, summits, trade shows, engaging your customers in a way that works for them while you're working from home means that enablement and marketing budgets need to move to these online channels to do a better job of touching those audiences. You really need to think particularly about people who have like field sales organizations that are now completely disconnected from the people that they were visiting on a regular basis. As we've seen with this event particularly, and others like it, summits are all online, but your eyeballs are able to wander. You can tune me out right now, go and do your laundry, whatever you want while you're working from home. So your content needs to be short, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be valuable or it will be tuned out really quickly. Your job as a sales enablement leader is deeply seated in the art of communication. And now that communication requires regularity, predictability, and a high degree of utility to ensure that it isn't tuned out. We used to be able to rely on weekly in-person meetings, and they were incredibly invaluable to convey messaging and update you on direction for the business. But virtual one-on-ones, as we've seen, can be prone to distractions and don't garner the same attention span. So now we're dealing with things like weekly or daily email updates, but reps are also being inundated with tons of inbound email from a number of different sources and Slack channels and all of that stuff. So expect those messages to get buried. You're far better off with leave behind consumable content or doing a Zoom call with your team so that they can consume it at a time when they're not burdened with something else that's going on, whether it's their internal distractions at home or just engaging with prospects whose schedules are also adjusted with these new realities. Coronavirus isn't going to be a requirement for everybody to temporarily adjust the way that they work with their corporate comms. This is the new normal. And you'll need to elect, you'll want to see that people are engaging with you perpetually throughout this. And I'm talking about your sales team here. So a lot of people are going to continue to work from home, and you may want them to. Shopify today just announced that their entire sales organization is remaining or is staying home. In fact, their entire organization is staying home until the end of 2020 and into 2021. And they've said that work from home is going to be the new normal for them. So your team needs to remain current on announcements for sales and company-related updates, news on policy or process changes, competitors that are changing during this time as well, and customers that are, need regular sharing to drive informed and consistent messaging across the line. If you don't have a proper content strategy for your reps to access these announcements, key competitor coverage and whatnot, now is definitely the time to start thinking about that stuff and putting it into practice. This is something that's really personal to me. I get very frustrated with the number of inbound emails that I receive that are ill thought out. Sequences or cadences, depending on the platform that you're using, are really, really important to tweak at this point in time. Faux empathy versus real value. Is your new messaging unique? Is your old messaging still relevant? Am I telling customers something incremental to what they'd expect of my company or my brand? Is the new what's in it for me even acceptable? Is it empathetic? Is it on point? I've talked a little bit about empathy already. And most importantly, is the what's in it for me aligned to what your customers need right now? So most sales reps use platforms that set up much of their top of funnel activities so that it's on autopilot, but you need to reconsider some of those sequences and don't forget to review like your existing email flows and LinkedIn connections, because a lot of those email campaigns have one or two steps in them that are really leaning in and trying to guilt the buyer into taking a meeting. Now is definitely the time to do away with that stuff. We need to be more empathetic and more respectful and more generous with our help. Keeping it fresh. This is an obvious one. The time is changing very quickly right now. Every day there's new information and new things are unfolding for the businesses that you are working for, and of course just in the general marketplace. We need to continually fuel our reps with these new streams of plays so that they can adapt on the fly. You're likely talking to a new buyer, as I mentioned before, and that buyer has more pressure on them than ever before. So cutting through the noise will take exceptional skills, and it's going to take staying original with the way that you're messaging. So help your team follow the trends and movements in the market, enable them with that information so that they can take advantage of it. And as this crisis unfolds, develop new plays that are going to talk to the specific industries, the buyer personas, and the companies that they're engaging with granular, useful insight. Okay, 3 quick trends. So what can we expect? Distributed is the new normal. I'm not going to read all this to you, but you can see that 90% of us have all moved to remote right now. There's very few people that are still field selling or selling inside of an office right now. And a lot of people believe that this is the new model moving forward, that we won't be going back to the in-office experience anytime soon. Trend number 2, convergence of sales and marketing. So sales enablement and product marketing are more than just the distant cousins of one another. In most organizations, sales enablement grew out of product marketing or out of sales operations. Marketers in most organizations focus their energy more at the top of funnel traditionally, driving people into a call to action that creates a lead, which creates a demo. And it's important that they continue to retain that focus. But in companies practicing account-based marketing, these efforts are more like surgical strikes today and are moving deeper and deeper into the funnel. So again, that convergence of sales and marketing is really happening, and it's kind of focusing on that sales enablement role. And sales enablement is really in charge of driving that and bridging that consistency between both sides of the organization. Early stage sales teams, including inside sales folks or BDRs, need marketing to get creative with new ways to engage with prospects, new messaging, new channels, etc. Your field sales team, as I mentioned earlier, are completely unplugged from face-to-face experiences with their buyer, and they need a way to sustain personal connections with prospects and customers to compensate for that. We've actually started seeing things like virtual marketing-sponsored lunches that allow teams to get creative with the way that they're personally engaging people. So having lunch with your colleagues at other companies over a Zoom call or ordering it in for them. It's actually far less expensive than traditional trade shows and corporate travel anyway, so it's actually something to consider regardless. Any marketer will tell you that the holy grail for them is to connect the dots more granularly to contextual events inside of the sales process. So building relevant micro content to support those events is quite important. And as a sales enablement practitioner, managing remote teams and understanding attribution of the content and the calls to action and deal stages, et cetera, is really the new frontier that you need to try to unlock and try to find more and more accurate attribution metrics so that you can ladder that information up to your marketing organization and tell them how effective the content is that they're generating. And really, you're going to need to ensure you have the right tools in order for that to happen. Content chaos leads to content convergence. We used to let our content sit in the corporate Confluence drive or wherever it happened to be. The company playbook is no longer just a Google Doc, and it can't be shared on a shared drive with the rest of the business. Companies like HighSpot and Seismic and Showpad have really demonstrated that consolidating the content can be done in such a way that the company doesn't just have sales collateral more organized, but also easier for it to be packaged up and delivered and also monitored for engagement. This was really born out of a necessity for salespeople that were forming bad habits. I was pretty guilty of this. I used to save, case studies onto my desktop and then send them off to customers. And of course, they would become brand stale when we did rebranding or new case studies came out. We don't want people to circumvent those systems. So we're going to make it super easy for them to access that information and deliver it to their prospects. And by making it convenient, you're just going to add value to the process for everybody. Okay, so let's talk about enabling your distributed team. Everboarding is the new onboarding. Context and continuity of training is far more impactful when you think about something in an everboarding perspective. I don't know if you've all heard the term. This was actually something that was a buzzword that came out of a conversation from one of my reps, actually. So let's talk about this a little bit deeper. During the first few days or weeks within an organization, a new hire is typically presented with at least some form of in-person sales training. Of course, now it's not in person, it's virtual. Salespeople forget 90% of what they learn after just 1 month. So that first month of learning, gone in 12 weeks on average. Sales teams that reinforce training and stay up to date are simply more confident, they're more productive, and they're more efficient. And with sales training continuing to evolve and continued changes to market conditions, product, et cetera, the idea of upfront training, while helpful for general indoctrination, is really incomplete. We need to start thinking about learning in key moments of truth, as that's going to be far more impactful. And everboarding focus will help you tailor your curriculum to the seller's journey, and it will drive the retention of information way up as well. So just remember that in-person training is also a foundation for building a relationship with one's boss and coworkers and other departments. And you need to realize that some of the other challenges inherent in remote-based onboarding are going to need to be addressed in a different way as well. There's not going to be that camaraderie anymore. So we need to think about that as we're building that curriculum up. I don't think that you need to make wholesale changes to your content. I just think you need to figure out ways to build it into building blocks that are more digestible for your overall team. Virtual training and coaching. So I consider training and coaching to be very closely linked. You need to create a good syllabus of things like videos or quizzes or missions and some team building exercises that will help to enhance the process to increase engagement and retention across the team of the information that they're consuming. But progress check-ins are also going to be super important to ensure that your content is working and that your audience is totally gelling with it. If you implement the right tech for your onboarding process, this is going to help you to track and measure the progress that your individual reps are using or going through to understand retention, rehearsal, and in-field execution of that content. Reps will need a new way to be able to role play their conversations. And so we're seeing things like recordings or post-call reviews being done with platforms like Chorus or Gong, two great technologies out there, and there's a number of other ones that exist nowadays as well. But yeah, sales leaders need a way to be able to assess how individual reps are progressing and then be able to drill down on some of the challenges that they see in the way that they're conversing with the market. So just think about coaching a little bit more. Managers have always needed to provide coaching to individual sellers to help them improve. Reps themselves need to see how they stack up against their peers as well. Otherwise, you don't really have a good benchmark. And you should always have a way of seeing what the top performers are doing. So you need to think about how you're going to incorporate that into your program as well. Think about how you can adapt what you've been doing to an online setting. And rather than asking your reps to come prepared, think about how you can come prepared as a coach or as a manager in advance so that you don't have a lot of wasted time. Again, sellers' time is really precious right now. They got a ton of pressure on them to perform. So the more you can come prepared rather than doing the whiteboard session on breaking things down in the meeting, the better those meetings are going to be. Virtual training and coaching are really just going to gain momentum through what we're doing right now. And so we're just going to need to continue to adapt to become more effective for a remote seller. Coaching the pivot points. This is something I really, really care about. You need to identify and build out like a plan for all of those unique paths that happen in a deal. Every deal is totally different from every other deal. When you think about like an athlete, they're continuously pivoting when they're on the field. They're changing direction after a quick pause to continue down toward their target, the goal line, whatever that happens to be. And reps really need to do the same thing within their deals. They need to know what to say and what to do in your absence. So you need to optimize your one-on-ones and your digital resources to be able to help build those pivot points organically. And the pivot points really let your reps adjust their actions on the fly so they can stay aligned to their buyer who is, new in every single conversation. You get a new buyer and a new individual that has new objections and new information, etc. And we're really just trying to help our sellers to consume micro doses of learning now so that they can take those individual packaged components of learning and use them in unique situations. The best reps that I know have super good situational awareness to be able to pivot to the right plays on the fly. And with strong coaching and online rehearsal, solutions like Lessonly or Saleshood are really good at building out like well thought out, realistic role plays that you can record and review afterward. Your reps are going to be able to learn how to handle those different situations, while the organization is, of course, going to gain confidence that the salespeople are more than capable of handling those situations on their own while remote. Another really important thing, the virtual water cooler. We have to remember sales is actually a pretty tight little, I don't want to call it a fraternity because I don't want to turn this into an engendered issue, but it's a really tight group of individuals. And we need to encourage that continuous and meaningful communication between reps to help build out storytelling and, more importantly, to build the camaraderie and culture that's going to be missing when people are remote. You need to give your reps time when managers are not on a call. So it's kind of like the equivalent of like a players only meeting in sports where they can work with each other to try to rally around each other, sharing their wins and losses and selling tips that might help each other. And I would actually consider inviting customer success to some of those calls so they can talk about like the post-sale anecdotes as well. This can be a challenge when every rep is working from home and is super bogged down with their own stresses and their own workload, but prioritizing meaningful, albeit virtual conversations can have a real impact on the morale and performance of your team. So I would recommend just creating an easy way for reps to stay centrally connected where they can share videos or call snippets that go through some of their everyday small wins and losses. I wouldn't necessarily always talk about the big wins and the big losses because that can be a real confidence hit to people that are maybe in a tougher sector. Give them those reusable deal anecdotes and even work from home best practices that they can share amongst each other. Some people may have done it more than others in the past. You'll learn more from your reps in an informal session where they take the lead on the session with one another and their one-on-ones with each other. But more importantly, they'll learn a lot from each other as well. So as part of those team micro sessions, salespeople probably need to know that their efforts are having impact, not just individually, but collectively. So sharing where deals are overall in aggregate. Again, you're kind of living in a vacuum when you're working remotely. So showing like where the overarching pipeline is and is going to help to teach the team why some deals are moving. And that's really important as well. And if that's done right, it can serve as a great motivator to the team and that really help drive confidence, even in the most uncertain of times. So share and share often, even if it's just a quick 5-minute gathering at the end of each day. Talk about the little wins, the little challenges so that your team can rally around each other. Do not forget or ignore your frontline managers. Your sales managers are probably some of the most lost people within the organization right now. Sales managers are in a new territory right now. Most of them have never managed remote teams, nor have they been equipped to do so. And so your enablement program doesn't just have to think about how you're going to enable your inline seller or your individual contributor, but also your managers. A colleague of mine just took a new job at a new company where day one was fully remote, never met the manager in person, never met anybody from the organization in person, and every day since has been the exact same way. There's no opportunity to build rapport or learn in person. Sales managers really need to adapt to those new situations as well. So having, some skills being taught to them is going to be quite important. One of the most important action items for new sales leaders or for sales leaders in general is really just giving managers additional training on how to manage that team virtually. So think about like new standards of how you can build your one-on-ones between managers and their team. Think about how you can work with underperformers that you need to level up or try to improve the performance of. It's totally different than when you can actually sit on a call with them remote or in person and pick up on their body language, etc. Managers should try to budget additional time to do the role plays with people that are struggling. Try to teach your managers what KPIs to allocate their energy toward as well, and find ways to reduce the back and forth required to update the forecast. Sales managers have to ladder information up. They also have to work down. And when there's gray involved in that, the information disconnect just grows. So you really need to work on some of those things to help them with their KPIs, et cetera. And I would actually say one last thing on the manager stuff, get your managers to work together in role plays as well so they can learn from one another if you do have a multiple manager organization. So this one, again, really important. How adaptive is your playbook? I like to think of playbooks or every single deal as like a choose your own adventure experience where you start in one spot and you end up somewhere completely different by the end of it. Obviously, you're trying to get to the last page, which is the closed one in every single one of them. But along the way, there's lots of different steps. So no two situations at sales are ever going to be exactly the same. It's kind of absurd to think that we can linearly teach you these robotic systems to get from the top of funnel to the bottom of funnel. They're totally like a game of Plinko. So think about how your digital playbook strategy can elevate rep adoption by acknowledging that different deal paths do exist in today's opportunities. There's different buying stages, there's different buyer personas, there's varied compelling events and triggers, there's endless combinations of issues and needs. And if you add more influencers into the mix, as we're seeing right now with higher laddered up decision makers, those only become more geometrically multiplied, those complex nuances. So the format and the design of your current playbook isn't really helping your reps if it's in a traditional sales motion. So we need to think about how we can break it down. Remember that encyclopedia set that your parents had on the shelf that you never really wanted to look at? That's kind of what the old playbook looks like. When a football team builds a playbook nowadays, it's broken down into sections for particular situations. You usually have like a red zone offense or a red zone defense. Why? Because with a more condensed field, you need a separate set of plays that will handle that so that you understand your strategies to score or to prevent somebody from scoring. So your playbook needs to think the same way to adjust to those specific situations and make it easier to digest and more memorable for your sales team, and you're going to get better retention out of it. And it'll change that lukewarm reception that they typically give your big, massive playbook that you have shared with them traditionally. Simplify content sharing. So this really gets at the ability of a salesperson to distribute their content to a buyer much easier than they could have before. If you use the right tools to share content, it will help your seller to optimize the timing of their follow-up engagement as well. We can pixel track when somebody engaged with content, and we'll have a far better understanding of like what we should do next in our sales process, which will help with some of the unpredictability. Serious Decisions recently reported that 82% of B2B buyers make their purchases based on experience, the head of price and the head of product. So if you want your remote sellers to provide exceptional experiences, really got to help them optimize the insights that they're getting into the content that's being interacted with so they know when to plug themselves back into a sales process. I mentioned a few of those solutions before, Seismic, Showpad, et cetera. Okay, I'm going to wrap on this slide. This is the last one before we just get into a bit of Q&A at the end here. But I hope that everybody has understood the message that I try to bring to this, which is really keep it simple. Don't just keep it simple squared. This is super important to making sure that your playbook and your enablement program is well adopted. You can't expect your long form playbook content to work well for remote workers. It's a reference that they will seldom use it. So try to create those micro plays that can be delivered in different situations. The anecdotes, the small snippets, like you have snippets that you inject into an email sequence at top of funnel. Think about the snippets that you can inject into a deal or into a conversation, the different playbook cards that could be used. You're going to find that by doing so, you're going to get far higher retention while making it far easier to identify potential weaknesses and knowledge gaps in your playbook and insert and unplug things on the fly. After you convert your traditional playbook into a micro playbook, your reps are going to be able to confidently switch gears between things like customer buying journey stages, buyer personas, specific use cases, industry and vertical domain knowledge, competitor landmines, personal win statements to move deal forward. And this is something I think Colin and I were classically trained the same way to try to find personal win statements. So that's a big one that I try to stress. And a multitude of other things you're going to want to have in there. So if you build your playbook component specifically tailored toward situational sales interactions, you're going to have far higher uptake and better results with it. Teach your salespeople when to use the right pieces of the story at the right time. And that's half the battle, but making sure that they don't tune you out is really the other half. So in 2019, more than half of all employees around the world worked outside of the head office, and at least 1/3 of the time they were out of the office, regardless of whether they were in the office or not. In 2020, we're going to see that multiply to the nth degree, and obviously we're seeing that because of COVID. But I don't think it's going to stop. It's just going to be the trend moving forward because people are realizing that they can work remotely and still be successful. So whether in the office or working remotely, your sales team needs your support and your program needs to adapt to those needs. Welcome to your new reality. And let me help you work to get ahead of this. And obviously there's lots of other great people that can help you as well. So I'm happy to field any questions that you might have. You're welcome to email me directly or look me up on LinkedIn. And if you want to see Duly Live, we'll help you implement a good content strategy for your business. Thanks. That's it. Colin, I got to breathe now.
All right. Thanks, Kris. I'm just pulling up the Q&A here, and for whatever reason, I can't get the Q&A and the chat up side by side. But Ray was curious, and I'll just ask everybody. We covered quite a bit there. Let me get Twitch to like a reasonable graphic there. Beautiful. And I'll add myself back in here as well if I have to. Here we go. Oh, there I am. If you got a question for Kris, throw it in the chat now. We're going to get to that in a sec, or we're getting to those right now. So let's jump in. Ray was asking, do users have to have a Salesforce account to use Duly? Tried to sign up, but it seems like it won't let me go forward without a Salesforce account.
Yeah, you do. You need a Salesforce account. Sorry, I don't want to answer product questions on this. I want to talk to the content, but yeah, you do. You need a Salesforce account. If you don't have a Salesforce account, you can't use Duly today. Talk to me in 3 months and we might have a different answer for you.
Cool. Thanks, Kris. All right, let's have a look at the chat here. For whatever reason, it keeps pulling this up. Sarah, can you see the chat?
I can see.
Oh,
I can see the chat. Yeah, I'll scroll through there. There's nothing in the chat.
Nothing in the chat. Okay, cool. Kris, this has been unreal. I'm curious with what you're seeing with everything surrounding like playbooks going like you said, like digital. Digital's not the right way. Not the right way.
I call it micro digital. Microdose.
You keep throwing microdosing in there, which just brings up a whole slew of other things. But don't you see, like, if we're getting into these other platforms, aren't we getting more and more disconnected with the content because now there's been so much effort that has been put into getting these playbooks into them? It's so much more effort to keep them updated and keep them alive.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the role of the sales enablement org. And I think that one thing I may not have mentioned in my time was the sales enablement person is being measured based on their performance. And they need to figure out some sort of an attribution model. They need to figure out, like, how are they implementing deals? Because if they're not, their job is going to become redundant pretty quick, right? Especially when you're looking at, like, who you're going to cut on a team when you have budget cuts. So I do think that it's important for the enablement team to show how they're performing and how they're influencing business. And the reason I think that's important is because that's how you're going to grow your team. And so if you're having problems maintaining the curriculum, maintaining the content that you have, it's probably because your organization is too small or your content is too bulky and unwieldy. Your reps are your first litmus test for understanding whether your content is going to work or whether it's not going to work. They will tell you. And if you give them a good feedback loop or a good feedback mechanism on that content, you can find out pretty darn quick whether something needs to be shifted. I've talked about this in previous conversations, but you almost want to think about on your playbook content, putting an NPS score on every individual piece of content to see if it's performing or not. Your reps will actually give you really good feedback through that. And it's like, yeah, I tell other people this is a good piece of content to use or a good conversation point, or yeah, this one's useless. We no longer have that benefit over this competitor. We need to wipe this thing out.
Perfect. We get a question from Jay here, but we also got one from Twitch that Julian just sent me. The person, I don't have their handle, but it says, great stuff, Kris. Our number one persona had their market crushed. They're optimistic, it's coming back, but many are still laid off. Yep. Any advice how to gauge when they're ready to re-engage?
Well, I would say, just broadly thinking about that, you need to just keep monitoring market conditions, right? So if you understand outside in selling, you'll always think about your buyer from the perspective of the industry that they work in. So you'll know pretty quick if they're in travel and tourism, it's going to take a while, right? The company that they work for, the vertical, the role that you're selling to, all of those different things are I guess, assessment points as to whether a market is coming back. And of course, just looking macro at the economy and restrictions easing, et cetera, will give you a good sense. Again, if I was thinking about airlines, et cetera, probably not coming back in the same way anytime soon. So you have to think about like a different set of mechanics or movements to try to move those deals forward. I don't know if I have a good answer. Like I can't assess whether a market is going to come back or not, but I can tell you this: when somebody is struggling in a market, and I have customers of our own product that sell into travel and tourism or into hospitality, like restaurants, et cetera. And I work right underneath the restaurant right now. It is dead quiet up there. That person is not spending right now, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to be informed. If you want to earn their business when they do come back online, now is the time to double down on being valuable in other ways. Really nurture those relationships so that they don't ghost you when it's all coming back. As soon as the green light goes on that restaurant above me, man, they're going to be busy trying to figure stuff out. As I was walking in today, just as a side note, the things that they're doing inside of their restaurant to innovate should give you a sense that they want to come back. Shower curtains between the tables on shower curtain rods, like see-through shower curtains, all sorts of cool stuff. They're innovating. They're thinking about how they're going to get their business back and operational. You need to be innovating and thinking about how you're going to help them get their business back and operational.
Beautiful. Well said, Kris. And that was from Noah Bloom on Twitch. You guys are both in the Slack chat if you want to follow up on that conversation.
Noah. I know Noah.
Thanks for that, Noah. We got one last one, and then we're going to call it for the day, for the session, for the event. And so Jay sent one to us and asking, what specific tools would you recommend for tracking engagement for clients viewing proposals on their own time, not guided by my sales rep?
Can you ask me that one more time? I want to make sure I understood the second half of the question.
Yeah. What specific tools would you recommend for tracking engagement for clients viewing proposals on their own time?
Okay. There's a couple different ones that I've experienced, and I'm not the guru in all this stuff, but in terms of things that I've played around with, PandaDoc is pretty cool. I use a product called Quiller, QWILR, a little company out of Australia. They just raised about $10 million, so they're not going away anytime soon. Pretty cool little product in that you can really personalize the experience on a piece-by-piece approach to how you do your pricing. There's all your traditional CPQ solutions that are out there as well. Some of them do a better job than others of tracking engagement. And you can still use traditional, or I would say more holistic enablement solutions that you can put your proposals into, like a seismic or a high spot or a show pad as well. And you can see what parts of the proposal people are engaging with too. So don't really have a preference on which one. Just pick a tool that I think aligns with how you would typically present pricing. We tend to be a little bit less focused on the proposal because our product is a little more product led, meaning that people are likely just going to leave their credit card behind. So my way of putting a proposal together would be fundamentally different from somebody else. I need a little bit more context to be able to give them a really good answer for their business.
That's fair. I'll end with two pieces. So Ray's saying, thanks, Kris. You made for a great closer. Really enjoyed it. I did as well. If you're curious about Kris's sales cycle, we just actually recorded a podcast that should be dropping in the next couple of weeks. And we talked about the product qualified opportunity, very different than the product qualified lead, as you will learn in the podcast. If you want to check that out, it'll be live on the podcast shortly. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, wherever you might find your, wherever you might download your podcasts. Big thanks to Kris for joining us today. Really appreciate this, buddy.
Thank you. I wish you continued health, and I hope that everybody's businesses are still thriving even through this pandemic. We can really work hard together to try to get ourselves through this. Tech is going to lead the way in a lot of the solutions to getting ourselves out of this crisis. So keep busting your butts, everybody. I think we're on a good path.
Right on. And thanks for the kind words of support, Jay, Todd, Jonathan. We see you. We appreciate it. Love your support. Really appreciate this. And hit us up with an email. Find us in Slack. Let us know what we can do better for next time. There definitely is going to be a next time. We had a lot of fun and really appreciate just one last shout out to the tremendous team here at Predictable Revenue. Sarah for being the co-host all day. Sebastian for hanging out on the line. Julian for monitoring the Twitch and texting me anytime I screwed anything up. Julia for everything, like being the glue that held all this together. Veronica and Gabby and Alex and Marisol for basically doing absolutely everything else. I had the luxury of, I just said, hey, let's do this thing. And, I contributed a couple ideas here and there, but you are all the team that actually made this happen. So thank you. I am very, very grateful to have such a great team to work with.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together, Colin. Props to you as well. I know that everybody's adapting to this online world and trying to create great experiences for everybody. You did a great job. Whole team. Awesome work. Thanks for including us.
Thanks, Kris. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
You so much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for co-hosting as well. And yeah, thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to the speakers. It's been a great event.